Yeah, sure, no problem. I'll just make the introduction. Hi, everyone. This is Ashwani from Criminal Research and Review. And on behalf of our team, I welcome everyone over here for joining and for being here for the awareness session. And we are joined by Ms. Chetna Venkataraghavan who will be conducting the session for us. Chetna is practicing lawyer and practice appears before family courts, trial courts, and Madras High Courts, and deals with matters relating to domestic and other gender-based violence, sexual abuse, and gender identity issues. She was recently awarded with South Asia Women Foundation India Litigation Fellowship, where she will be assisting women and trans people in the trial courts of Tamil Nadu, and will also be providing legal advice to pre-litigation strategy. I personally know Chetna because she's an alumni of our Gujarat University where I did my LLB, and she was very, she was also
we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. She also the head of the debating society from where I personally know her, and on a slightly lighter side, when I joined General in 2016, and I was attending first few sessions of the debating society. We were really excited to meet Chetna because Ujjwal gave a really good introduction of her. That
I paid him good money for that.
So yeah, we for that time, for us first year, you were really a great person because of Ujjwal, the way he introduced you. So it's good to be a part of a session where I think it's the first time that I'm a part of any session as such where you are also there. So with this, I think I'll invite Chetna to take over and start the session. And thanks a lot for being here.
No. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's far more than what I deserve. So, like I said, I'm practicing in Chennai right now. I used to work in a corporate law firm before this, but I really wanted to litigate. So I'm back in my hometown in Chennai, and I'm doing it. I'm also dealing with some aspects of the Prevention of Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act in terms of orientation sessions for colleges, workspaces, and the internal complaints committee themselves. And I think it's really, really important that we all know about what the Act says. And by Act, I'm only going to mean the Prevention of Sexual Harassment in the Workplace Act. Sometimes it's abbreviated to POSH Act. That Act has rules. And in addition to that, if you are a college student or anyone who is part of a higher education institution, the UGC, the University Grants Commission, also has its own regulations against sexual harassment on campus. In my opinion, the UGC rules are more advanced than what's provided in the Act, but everything with respect to the UGC rules is also modeled on what is there in the POSH Act. So we're very quickly going to examine what the POSH Act says and then move on to the UGC rules. And just knowing about the prevention of sexual harassment, I always say it's like fire safety training. I really hope none of you have to use it ever, but in the event that you do, it's always good to be prepared. And in the event any of your friends have a complaint or your acquaintances, and then the fact that one person knows what your rights are and what you can do about it makes a huge difference. I'm also very aware as we are speaking that not all colleges are student friendly. Not all colleges have internal complaints committees in place. Not all colleges look kindly to LGBTQIA students, women students. There are inequitable rules still, from hostel timings to dress codes. I'm keenly aware of all that. And I'm also aware that while these rules and these acts are present, the ground reality is very different, and that we are all fighting for far more basic things, but that doesn't mean we can't fight for this as well. So at the end of the session, we'll also deal with how you can hold your campus more accountable and what you can do to have those rules in place if they already don't exist. So let's now move on to the POSH Act and then the UGC rules. With respect to questions here, since this session is rather structured, I think it'll be best if we take questions at the end of the session. Is that okay with everybody?
I think that's the best way to go.
Yeah, cool. And
Yeah.
if there is anything pressing that needs my clarification so that the rest is made more clear, please feel free to drop a chat. Can you guys also keep monitoring the chat and let me know if there's something I have to explain? That'll be very helpful.
Yes, we are keeping an eye on the chat box and on the YouTube live comments.
Okay, great. So yeah, let's start here. So India's history with respect to anti-sexual harassment laws actually go back to the 1990s. So our Indian Penal Code and our criminal laws are vastly what the British left us with. So they are very antiquated and extremely colonial in nature. So they deal with things like outraging the modesty of the woman. They did not have provisions to deal with sexual harassment as such. So they were very antiquated notions on what constitutes harassment and when and who can be harassed. For example, even now the IPC is extremely gendered. It's only the woman who can file these complaints. And as is the POSH Act. Under the Act, only an aggrieved woman can file a complaint against someone. But however, the UGC regulations make it very clear that it's not gendered. And in fact, they go over and beyond and also include members of the LGBTQIA community in its ambit. So that's a very important distinction right off the bat between what is between the POSH Act and the UGC regulations. So in the 1990s, there was a case in the Supreme Court called Vishaka versus State of Rajasthan. So the facts of the case are when a social worker in Rajasthan went to prevent a child marriage from taking place, she was gang raped by the members of the dominant caste community there. Then the NGO took her to the Supreme Court, who then realized that there's a huge lacuna with how, as a country, we address sexual harassment and complaints about that. So the Supreme Court put in place certain guidelines with what is the definition of sexual harassment, what constitutes sexual harassment, and the punishment for sexual harassment. These came to be known as the Vishaka guidelines, and they were in force until we got a special act that dealt exclusively with prevention of sexual harassment in the workplace. So until that act came, we had the Vishaka guidelines, and then the act came. And now what is in force is the act. So some important features about the act is that any workplace with more than 10 people has to have an POSH policy and an internal committee in place. So it used to be called the Internal Complaints Committee, and then there was an amendment in 2016 that made it the Internal Committee to deal with all complaints that come emerging from workplace situations. So the internal committee, any place with more than 10 employees is supposed to have an internal committee. Now, what constitutes sexual harassment has been defined in the Act. So it does not just deal with gestures, with words, with showing pornography and everything we know explicitly to be sexual harassment. The Act also says certain implicit acts like promise of preferential treatment, saying, if you do this or if you come out with me, you will get promoted, and threats of detrimental treatment, like if you don't do this, you will suffer the consequences. So all those also constitute sexual harassment. So the Act makes it clear that sexual harassment consists of explicit gestures as well as implicit things such as this. Now, there are some examples that we can have, like let's take examples of online harassment, because the world has moved online since COVID, right? Let's say sending extremely sexist and inappropriate jokes on WhatsApp and then brushing it off as say, why don't you have a sense of humor? So if you are uncomfortable being the recipient of such a message. And if it is sexual in nature, you can tell them, stop, I am not comfortable with this. And if they continue to do it, it will constitute harassment. So harassment is subjective. It's what you as a person feels violative and breaking into your space and your boundaries. And it needs to have a sexual overtone. If it does not have a sexual overtone, it doesn't mean that it's meaningless. It can take on different shapes. It can be workplace harassment. It can be ageist harassment. It can be gender-based discrimination and harassment. But sexual harassment is something that needs to have a sexual overtone and be sexually and have sexual nature for you to feel uncomfortable with this. So you can say, no, I am not comfortable with this. Please don't follow me back to my cubicle. Don't stand in my way. Don't block me. Don't stalk me. And if they continue to do that, all of it will constitute harassment. So anything done with a sexual intent. So let's just keep it simple, that you as the recipient of that action feels uncomfortable with. Now, what happens after this? Like, what is the mechanism that needs to be in place for me to deal with sexual harassment complaints? Is that first I need to have a policy in place, and this you can either have a policy or you can say the act will apply. So in all workplaces that have an internal committee, they say that the act applies, and some organizations go over and beyond it and have their own policy with their own twist, such as some of it is gender neutral. Others consist of, they also sometimes include intimate partner violence. Others bring in the ambit of hierarchies in relationships between people in an organization, like a senior partner trying to get an intern to have sexual relations with them, and they look at the imbalance in the power structure of these relationships. So organizations around the country are taking note of these things and are including these as part of their policy. The university, the UGC regulation also has a very interesting take on this. We'll come to that as when we go to the UGC regulation. So the internal committee should always consist of at least 4 people. Like, keep this in mind. Some organizations have only 1 or 2 or 3. No, under the act, you need to have at least 4 people. The first should be a presiding officer who's a woman. The other 2 should be people involved in the organization. And finally, you should have an external member, a social worker or a lawyer who knows the laws. And more than half of them should be women in an internal committee. So how do you give this? And then details of this committee and details of policy, if any, should also be exhibited in prominent places for people to see. Now, how do you give the complaint is always in writing. In case somebody is unable to give their complaint in writing, the internal committee should help them to condense that complaint to writing. Let's say that a contract worker who is employed to sweep the college campus is being subjected to sexual harassment, and this person is illiterate, and they can only give a complaint orally. So under the UGC regulations and under POSH, the internal committee should do everything possible to help her reduce that complaint to writing, and a written complaint will be filed to the internal committee. A copy of this will then be forwarded to the person against whom the complaint is given, and then the inquiry process will begin. Now, I'm not going into details of the inquiry process under the Act, because then we won't have time to deal with the UGC rules. So I think let's all go to the UGC rules. Now we have a little bit of background about the POSH Act. So all higher education institutions have to abide by these UGC regulations. Now, there are different stakeholders under this UGC regulation. They are students, most importantly, who are continuing their course in both regular mode and in distance mode. You can't say that, oh no, she's not a student, she's doing this distance course program, an online course, so she doesn't really fall under the category of students. No, universities can't wash their hands off by saying that. Then employees, which include interns, volunteers, and teaching research assistants. And it includes the administration of the university, it includes professors, it includes basically everybody as a student or as a professor you come in contact with on the university campus. It can also include people who just occasionally visit the campus, let's say a chief guest, or let's say a performance artist for a cultural program, who enters the campus and who interacts with the students are also covered under these regulations. And what constitutes the campus is very wide. Universities can't wash their hands off if, let's say, an act happens in a cultural program, or the act happens in an offsite retreat, or the act happens in, let's say, if you're going to research something on site for a college related activity. So anything you do in furtherance of your education and anything you do as a result of being a student and belonging to the college, wherever you go, the library, the ground, another college, it will come under the definition of campus, and any act that happens there will fall under the UGC regulations against sexual harassment. Now, the types of harassment covered are also not just sexual harassment on campus, like we already discussed, third-party harassment by a visitor on campus. So this is all captured in the UGC regulations itself. So in addition to the definition, now with respect to what constitutes sexual harassment in these UGC regulations, in addition to what's already mentioned in the Act, the UGC regulations also state that an act that creates a hostile learning environment and that affects the health, safety, and dignity of the students would constitute sexual harassment. And always the sexual intent of the act is also very important in these cases. Now, another important thing about the UGC regulations that I think is noteworthy is that they spell out vulnerable groups. Vulnerable groups to them consist of LGBTQIA plus people who are discriminated on the basis of religion, class, caste, sexual orientation, minority identity, and are differently abled. So the UGC regulations kind of creates a pocket of acknowledgement where it says that there are certain groups of people who are more prone to harassment, and the university should take measures to protect them. So now let's move on to who constitutes the internal complaints committee in a university. Like, is it different from POD? And the answer is yes. The basics are always the same everywhere. There is a presiding officer who's a woman. There will be 2 faculty members. There'll be 1 external member, possibly from an NGO, and 2 non-teaching employees. These are all members of the organizations themselves. Now, as opposed to the POSH Act, where a minimum of 4 people are required, under the UGC regulations, 6 people minimum are required. Now, interestingly, the UGC regulations say if the offense involves students should also be part of the internal committee. So these they actually specify the categories, like 3 categories: undergrad, graduate, and research scholars, who should be voted in through a democratic process. Now, what this democratic process is has not been defined under the UGC regulations. It is open to interpretation, and it really depends on how each college views democratically electing people. Like in GNLU, we didn't have unions. I don't know if that still continues. We didn't have student elected representatives. We had students who were chosen by faculty members to voice the grievance of a batch, but they were by no stretch of imagination democratically elected. So how each university perceives how they want to vote in students to the ICC may be different. But remember that if the internal complaints committee that you're part of in college seems very one-sided, with just senior faculty members sitting there who you feel are already judging you for your actions before the inquiry proceedings have even begun, like it is in most cases, you can request for a student to be part of the internal complaints committee, because that is a provision in the UGC regulations. And it also clearly specifies that high-ranking administrative officials like the VC, the registrar, the dean, or heads of department cannot be members of the internal complaints committee to ensure autonomy. So that's also there. Now let's say, how do I give this complaint as a student? It's going to be very different from how you give a complaint as an adult, because, and another important factor, before I forget, I also want to say that also elements of POCSO Act will apply, because sometimes When you enter university, you are 17. I was 17 when I entered college. So, and I was not yet a major. So POCSO is the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. The age of consent in this country is 18. Any sexual act with a person lesser who's not yet 18 is an offense. So POCSO also has different degrees. It has penetrative sexual assault, it has sexual assault, it has sexual harassment. And in an ideal world, university should also have a child protection policy in place, and they should also be able to handle POCSO complaints, because there would be people who have not yet hit majority go into those colleges. So it should ideally be that, but I don't think it's there in most universities across India. Now let's come back to how do I give the complaint, right? Like, and I'm not looking at this from the perspective of you are an adult who knows a little bit more about procedural formalities when you give the complaint. I'm just looking at how does a scared kid who is probably 19 or 20 give a complaint if an act of sexual harassment has occurred to the internal committee. First thing is write everything down in writing. If you are unable to write, if you feel that you do not have the mental strength to write what has happened to you because it's traumatic, please take help from somebody else and condense what has happened to writing. You can even, I don't know, if something has happened, you can even see if there will be a friend to help you, and you can send voice notes of what has happened, and then it can be in writing. Now, when can I file this complaint? Is the act says within 3 months of the act of sexual harassment having occurred, you should file a complaint. But there is also leeway. The act also says that in case the person is unable to give this complaint within 3 months, the internal complaints committee will record that reason in writing. And if the reason is valid, the person will be allowed to proceed with their complaint. So same would be applicable to the UGC regulations. So even if the period of 3 months have lapsed, if you still want to file a complaint, you can. Now, the reason why I say condense everything to writing and make sure that what you give first contains most of the evidence. Like, and I'm also saying this, I'm keenly aware that sometimes a very traumatic incident can, cause memory loss, and you may forget what has happened, or you may have purposely blanked it out for you to move on with your life, and that it can involve significant amount of counseling and therapy for you to be able to even put what has happened to writing. I would recommend that you put everything that has happened, that whatever you can remember in writing, give all the evidences, list out all the witnesses, and then submit it to the internal committee. While, let's say, you suddenly recall a fact or remember something that has happened later on in the proceedings, it's completely within your right to be able to submit it to the internal complaints committee. But always remember that there'll be an air of suspicion and doubt when you do it at a later stage, even though your reasons may be completely valid. So it's just always best if you can gather everything in one place and give a consolidated complaint to the internal committee, and that complaint is going to be the foundation for the rest of the inquiry. Now, this complaint will be forwarded to the person against whom the complaint is given for his response. Now, the Act envisages this concept of conciliation. Now, conciliation is one step before the inquiry proceedings actually begin. Conciliation is when you have the option to be able to speak with the members of the internal committee and the person against whom the complaint has been given. Because in some cases, a person may not have the mental, emotional, financial wherewithal to actually take this case through to conclusion, and they may just want to get it over with an apology and a promise that it would never happen again, because different people have different ideas of closure. So conciliation is basically, and if there is such an apology, or if they say something and they sort it out within the conciliation meeting, there is no need for an inquiry proceeding to happen. The complaint can be closed at the stage of conciliation. But very important to remember, money or monetary settlement can never be the basis for conciliation. Now, let's say that conciliation fails and the inquiry proceeding actually starts. So the complaint will be forwarded to the person against whom the complaint is given. They'll have a certain period of time to give their counter or their version of what happened. And then after that, the internal committee will speak to witnesses. It will take a look at documents if there are any, and then it'll come up with its recommendations. These recommendations will range from if the complaint is true and if the committee feels that an act of sexual harassment has occurred, what can we do to the perpetrator? And the punishments range along from withholding privileges, suspending their entry from campus, to terminating their employment, whatever the committee feels fits what feels consummate to the act that has actually happened. Now, if the committee feels that no, we don't think an act of sexual harassment has actually happened, they can also give that recommendation and the complaint will be closed. Now, the question I get asked a lot is, but what if a false complaint is given? Again, something very important to note is inability to substantiate a complaint does not make it a false complaint. Most of these acts of harassment happen in closed regions. It happens in spaces where there are not many people, and you're not expected to live your life carrying a video camera, recording everything that is happening. So many times there is no evidence per se for this act of harassment. And your inability to prove it has happened does not automatically make it a false complaint. Now, what makes it a false complaint is if forged documents have been given. If, let's say, you have the screenshot is your evidence for a complaint and is later discovered to be morphed. Now, when things like this occur, the internal committee can proceed against the person who has given the complaint on the basis that they have given a false complaint. But once again, it's not going to be an automatic find of guilt. The committee proceedings will have to begin from scratch, like as if this is a new complaint they are taking on record. But this time, the person sitting on the other side is the person who has given the complaint. So that's how it usually works. So you can ask me, this would take quite some time for these inquiry proceedings to finish, but what do I do in the interim? Like, let's say that this is an act of harassment that has been perpetrated by a professor against a student. And while inquiry proceedings are ongoing, the same faculty member has the power to take my attendance, to correct my paper. Is there anything that I can do to prevent that from happening? Would be a very valid question now, right? To which the UGC regulations does speak about interim redressal mechanisms. So there are multiple interim is in the middle, like until the proceedings conclude, what can happen? First, they can consider transferring the person who has given the complaint or the person against whom the complaint has been given to another department. They can grant leave to the victim. This would be in addition to what they are normally entitled to. They can restrain the respondent from they can restrain the person against whom the complaint has been given from entering the campus. They can say that another professor or faculty member should evaluate the tests of the person who has given the complaint. And they can also say you keep a certain distance from the person who has given the complaint you in campus. So all these are, and they can even do more if they feel that that this department or this university is uniquely placed, and how they can handle it is up to the internal committee. But interim redressal mechanisms do exist, and the person who has given the complaint can definitely demand for it if they are not being granted. Yeah, and obviously the internal committee has a duty to help the victim. They have a duty to produce the witnesses if required. They have a duty to transfer a faculty member if they are in the same department as the person who has given the complaint. They have the duty to create an environment where people can come forward and give their complaints. Now, also these higher education institutions have a duty to frame anti-sexual harassment policies and to correct and to conduct sensitization and training programs for students. I don't know if it happens annually. It ideally should. I know for a fact that some universities have just let's say 15 to 20 minutes of it at the time of orientation of students, but they should ideally have it every year so that students know what they can do about it. And also on there is, and remember I told you about dynamics of power in POSH. The UGC does touch upon it. It specifies that there is a certain imbalance of power between, let's say, a professor and a student. And they especially say that doctoral students have it difficult because they work in such close quarters with their supervisors. So they also say that it acknowledges that these are groups that are particularly more prone to harassment also. So what can happen if your university does not have these UGC policies or rules? It can affect your funding, and if it's notified to the UGC can even strike their names off from its roster as a university or a college. Of course, I don't think it has been done in the past for not complying with POSH regulations, but it does exist in the regulation itself. There is the UGC website also has, and all colleges are also supposed to report how many cases of harassment were reported, how many were handled. This data is available on the UGC website. So to see if your institution is someone who's compliant with this or not, the UGC website where all this is reported is a good place to start. So what can you do, right? If your college doesn't have any of this, what can you do? I think you can, if you have student unions, please send representations through those unions. Make it clear to your university that non-compliance is going to affect them also in terms of their standing with the UGC and everything. Then how can you ask, like, how can you do? You can ask, you can maybe write saying, I checked our college website. The policy isn't updated. I don't know who members of the Internal Complaints Committee are. Can you please tell me? So if the college has one, they'll immediately reply. If the college doesn't have one, well, you'll know when they haven't replied to you in over a week. You can ask them about it later also, I guess. But that will be a good way for you to know whether your college has these in the first place or not at all. And you can also tell your college that you want training sessions, you want awareness sessions, and you want sensitization sessions also. And like I said, you can check the UGC compliance list to see if your college has been regularly updating it. So yeah, I think we have come to the end of our session. I hope I've not overwhelmed you with information, and I'm open to taking questions now if you have any. Sorry, I'm just going to switch off my video because bandwidth isn't great for me, but I'm available. I can hear you guys.
Thank you, Chetna. I will wait for comments if there are any. Please feel free to unmute yourself and speak, or you can also drop a comment in the chat box. We'll be happy to share it with Chetna.
Ma'am?
Hey, yeah, please don't call me ma'am, but please go on.
Okay. The burden of proof falls on which party? Like, if you do file a complaint and if they ask you to prove it, so that is not the victim's burden of proof, right?
So burden of proof, from what you know in criminal law, is different from how it happens in POSH. So it's not stringent that the burden of proof is always on the person who's alleging to prove it, right? So here you give your complaint and the victim's version of the truth does matter. Like I previously said, inability to substantiate it does not negate the complaint or make it invalid. However, if the person against whom the complaint is given is able to come and show that, they were never there on that day, or that they had other witnesses for them, or that they were there in an entirely different day, then it reverses back to you to show how the harassment actually happened. So burden of, there is no, let me put it this way, the traditional definition of burden of proof, like in criminal law, does not apply to quash proceedings. The inquiry proceedings that happen can imitate that of a court, but it does not strictly follow court procedure and court mechanisms. You can show videos, you can show screenshots, you can show recordings of calls to them. And if the committee wants, they can take all this into consideration. So burden of proof per se does not come into the picture, but like I always said, inability to substantiate complaint does not make the complaint invalid.
Okay, and ma'am, can we simultaneously file an FIR along with an internals complaint, or we have to first file like an internals complaint, and then if there is no action that we are not satisfied with, go with an FIR?
So that's a really good question. Your FIR and the internal committee complaint can happen parallelly. And in fact, your college has a duty to assist you to file that FIR should you want it. But in most cases, they all try to deter you from filing the FIR. But the reality is that both the Act and the regulations actually say that that the victim should be given all assistance if he or she wants to go ahead and file the FIR. So FIR and criminal proceedings can happen parallelly, nothing to stop it. Your internal complaints committee thing can also happen parallelly. Like there are some cases that, they may find the person guilty of sexual harassment under the POSH Act and not necessarily under the trial of a criminal code, because like you also previously asked me about burden of proof and all that, there's a chance that the perpetrator may be able to escape a criminal code, but what he or she did will fall under the definition of sexual harassment as under POSH and the UGC regulations.
Okay, thank you.
So it can happen parallelly. I think I've explained the second part of Anjali's question on chat with respect. When should we approach the police is your question. Okay, so I'm just reading out her question. Could you elaborate the part where you answer the question, what to do if your college doesn't have such policies? In that case, should we approach the police? So you can always approach the police irrespective of whether or not your college has these policies in place. Of course, going to the police in India is never easy. So how it happens is they give you if they record your complaint, they give a first information report. And this first information report after investigation becomes a charge sheet. And this charge sheet is sent to a criminal court and it takes on a calendar case number and criminal trial starts there. So that's the life of how an FIR becomes a criminal case. You can always go to the police whether or not your college has a policy, whether or not your college assists you. Now, what to do if your college doesn't have such policy is you have to keep reminding them about it. You can send emails to administration, you can send emails to heads of departments, you send emails to the registrar who are responsible for implementation of day-to-day compliances, because these are all, and you can also, if none of this materializes, you can file a complaint with the UGC. You can send a written representation to the UGC saying, my college does not have these mechanisms. Also, you can try sending the written complaint to your local complaints committee. So our internal complaints committee is envisaged under the Act where any workplace has 10 or more people. The Act also deals with local complaints committee who are constituted at the government level. Now, who your local complaints committee is something you should Google or find out or send RTIs and get the answers to. So if your college doesn't have such policies and if you don't know where to file the complaint, you can always file it with the local complaints committee. You can also send representations to your state Department of Women and Children. You can send it to the central department. You can send it to the local complaints committee saying your college doesn't have these policies. I'm just saying that if you cast your net wide and send representations to everybody, somebody has to respond to it. So if it gets really bad, you can do that. How you send these representations is I recommend you send it by registered post or speed post with an acknowledgement card, because these are things you can track online and it's considered as valid service rather than you sending it by private courier or you sending it by email. So if you send these by registered post, the post office will always give you a receipt to be able to track what you send. If you have it and if you know and you can track it online, and when you know it is being received, you save that also and you keep it to show that you have been trying for a long time to get your college to be more compliant with these things. You can push it across through unions. You can send it as women group representatives to colleges. You can send it through committees to head the administration. And I'm keenly aware that there are sometimes some people just simply don't want to hear what you're saying, even if what you're saying makes a lot of sense. In that case, then like we already discussed, you can try sending this representation to different people and government organizations. But that, of course, would be escalating the issue. So I would recommend you do your best to resolve it internally and try to convince your college to have these policies. If not, the other options are always available to you, irrespective of what your college and administration has to say.
Hi, Setna. I have sort of a comment on. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Please go on.
Yeah. So UGC regulation also have this clause that the parties can settle the matter, and especially in colleges.
Can you go from the top? I didn't catch the first part of your sentence. Sorry.
Yeah, right. So UGC regulation also have this clause that parties can settle the matter, and especially in Indian universities, colleges, it's very common for college administration to push parties, especially victims, to settle the matter internally without so that it won't damage their reputation.
Correct.
Right. So just I was just putting a sort of there, and let me know your thoughts on it. So even if parties settle the matter internally, they can still go to police and register an FIR and start a criminal proceeding, right?
Yes, they can, but just remember that it will look quite bad for this victim in her trial if all the respondent has to come is prove that, look, she closed the complaint there. I don't know why she is pursuing it here. So like what you say can theoretically happen, but I don't think it will practically happen that somebody closes the matter in conciliation and then takes it in FIR and to the cops.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, someone has it. Yeah, please go ahead.
But if that step can be countered by the college was, pressurizing me, holding grades or anything, as sort of blackmail, and I was forced to file an FIR so that a proper course of action could be taken. Will that hold in a criminal trial or will it fall off?
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand your questions and that the college will exert these influences. I'm just telling you that closure of the internal complaint that you have given at the stage of conciliation itself may be something that the respondent can use in trial. It can, of course, be defended from your side to say that there was sufficient pressure from the university for her to draft the complaint at the university level, and that's why she's taking it to FIR. Of course, you can do that. I'm just thinking aloud as a lawyer here and say that if such a complaint is closed at that level, it may affect how the criminal trial itself progresses. So if you are caught in such a state, I mean, I think what you can maybe do is at the stage of closing, universities have a policy of sending emails about what happened. Some universities also send minutes of meetings saying that, hey, this and this happened, you agree to withdraw your complaint, to which maybe even if you send out another email to that saying, I was forced to do it, and I had no intention of dropping it in conciliation proceedings, but my grades were being held up, and you can maybe write the reasons why you chose to close it in conciliation proceedings in that email and record it in some way that may be beneficial to you. So in all these cases, there is no perfect solution, I'm afraid. There are just ways wherein you can better safeguard your interest. So this is maybe one such way you can do it. Of course, these are all extremely theoretical things, and I know it's very different in the ground and practically. But you can also consider documenting why you closed the complaint if at all they give a closure report.
Anyone else has a question?
Ma'am, you once mentioned that sometimes underage people do get into college, so they can also be liable under POXCO. Now, which one holds more weight, POSH or POSCO? It's
POXO has
POXCO,
a
right?
policy of compulsory reporting, unlike POSH. So if anybody comes to even has an idea that an act of sexual, like a child has been abused, they have to mandatorily report it under law. And POXO is a criminal penal legislation wherein a criminal trial will happen and that person will go to jail for what has happened if they are found guilty. POSH, however, if you're found guilty under POSH, the internal committee will send a recommendation to the higher authorities who will then take a decision of what to do, and at best they can terminate employment. So always remember that the distinction between POXO and POSH is that POXO is the penal legislation with reporting being compulsory, and the consequences of being found guilty under POXO is imprisonment, whereas POSH is a legislation where only if reported that complaint will be taken up, and if the consequences of that complaint would not be imprisonment under POSH. Of course, if you concurrently file an FIR and in that criminal trial he's sent to jail, that's a different thing. But this is the main difference between POXO and POSH.
Thank you.
Anyone else wants to put any question or comment?
Ma'am, when you
Right.
mentioned,
Yeah, please go ahead, Annapurna.
if there's a time limit, I'll stop.
No, go on, please.
Yeah. So, ma'am, you mentioned about coworkers following you to your cubicle and stuff. So, as interns, when we do internships in our college in our starting years, so this is an intern's opinion or anything does not hold much weight, and then you risk not getting further internships with good firms. So usually, like, people like brush it under carpet or try to avoid those people instead of filing a complaint under POSH. So could you share, could you comment on how to deal with such power balance when you're just starting out in your career as not even a salaried job
it's
holder?
Definitely very difficult. I mean, I understand that if you choose to report that this has happened, there is a possibility that you may not be called to the same firm for an internship, and the firm will try to write it off as it being a subjective evaluation of them just not being comfortable with you. All those are risks that you take when you choose to go ahead and file a complaint. Unfortunately, Indian law does not, does not make the person liable for rejecting you on the grounds that they did not want you to report an act of sexual harassment. We are not that advanced, unfortunately. So we can't make out a case of discrimination on those grounds yet, unless it's extremely blatant. And even if it is extremely blatant, at the end of the day, they are private firms, right? So there is definitely a difficulty in what you do and in how you want to go ahead and report it. So there's really nothing that can be done if the firm or if, let's say, the university does not want to take you back for another internship or a callback internship because you reported an act of sexual harassment. You can maybe call them out on social media to a limited extent, but then again, I'm sure you guys have seen how calling out on social media has worked so far. It can either be effective and there will be public pressure upon them, or you open yourself to a threat of a defamation lawsuit.
Thank you.
No problem. And like going back to the question somebody asked me about what is the threshold required in this case is, like what I previously said is different from that of a criminal case. These posh inquiry proceedings in a criminal case is innocent until proven guilty, right? So prosecution has to do absolutely everything it can to show that that person is guilty. The threshold is lowered here. Like it's under posh proceedings, you don't have to go to the extent of being innocent until proven guilty. The burden, as somebody pointed out, will keep shifting between parties as and when the need arises. Like you say something and they counter it, and then you say if you have enough and more evidence about it. But definitely, posh proceedings don't have the same burden of proof as a criminal trial does.
Any further questions? Please feel free to ask any questions that you may have on the POSH Act or the UGC regulations. If there are no further questions from the audience, will Chetna, maybe you can close the meeting.
Sure, we can do that. Let's do that.
All right. Thanks a lot for for everyone for joining for this session, and for Chetna for conducting this session in such a beautiful manner, and for covering almost every important aspect of the POSH Act and
absolutely.
the
And even I'm learning as we're doing. So if anything I've said is incorrect, or if there is a different interpretation, I'd love to know about it so we can all discuss. So that's definitely.
All right. Thank you. And for the students who are here, if you haven't filled the questionnaire that we have released, please head over to our website, and you'll find the questionnaire link there. Please fill the questionnaire. If you have any comments on the POSH regulation or the Act, you can email us to our on our email address. We have 2 email addresses on our website. You can email to any of those, and we will be coming up with a report in the first half of 2022, and we plan to share it with UGC as well when we have a solid report ready based on the questionnaire and some inputs from outside about how a sample POSH policies for Indian universities or colleges should look like, what it should have, right? Because the regulations are certainly not enough, and maybe require some further addition depending on what kind of department or college you're dealing with, right? So with this we'll close it. And
also, just one small thing to add, RTI Act is a friend, guys. So of course, if you send RTI to your own college, the administration might just call you and have a chat with you. But at the end of the day, if you feel that it's okay, if you're okay with sending it to your college, most NLUs and most government colleges all fall under the ambit of RTI. So just go ahead and check out if there is any public information officer that you can send any queries to. If not in your name, you can ask your parents if they're okay sending it in their name. So that is definitely another thing you can exercise if you feel your college is not being transparent enough about the POSH Act.
Thank you, Chetna. And yes, and if you find that your college does not comply with the UGC regulation, please let us know as well, and we'll be happy to include it in our report as whenever we send it to UGC. And once again, thanks Chetna for joining for the session.
No problem. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
I am closing the meeting now.